If you remember a few months ago, I covered the Louisiana Northwest F units. In today's video, we are going to cover the rest of the L&W fleet up until Patriot Rail acquired the line in 2008. Welcome back to the series of What Once Was, where we take a look back at how the railroads of North Louisiana and its surrounding areas looked and operated in the past. Even after the well-known F units were phased out, the L&W's diesel fleet of red and yellow locomotives were easily identifiable by local rail fans and were sought after by many. While I personally was not old enough to properly document the L&W until after the red and yellow units ceased regular operation, I have many fond memories as a kid watching them run north and south out of my hometown. Thankfully, many before me were able to document and preserve the legacy of the classic L&W before its uniqueness was stripped away in favor of corporate unity. One of these rail fans was Mr. Most Cruz, who generously allows me to use many of his fantastic photos for these videos. So without further ado, let's dive into the classic red and yellow fleet that once served North Louisiana and South Arkansas. We start with number 50, the first of the diesels to arrive after the F units. 50 was a GP7 locomotive built in 1953 for the Union Pacific. The UP number 711, later renumbered to 111, served the UP for 26 years until it was retired in July of 1979. It would sit in storage lines for several months before UP would use it as a trade-in deal with General Electric in 1980. The following year would find number 50 in the possession of the L&W. In the locomotive shops in Gibson, Louisiana, the L&W would rebuild the locomotive, chop the nose, and give the locomotive its fresh paint. By early 1982, number 50 was ready for service. It would work north and southbounds until the early 2000s, when it was put out of service. In 2005, the locomotive was scrapped. The story of 51 is a very similar one. It was built in 1954 for the UP as number 286. It was a GP9 locomotive that was rebuilt in the Gibson shops as well. Like the 50, it was once a high hood that would be chopped. 50, 51, along with the 52, were originally set to operate long hood forward like many rail fans call Southern style. Along with the nose chop, the rebuild would include converting these motors to be able to operate short hood forward. These Gibson shops have been the site of countless projects throughout the L&W's history, from painting engines to complete rebuilds like the first few diesels after the F unit fleet. Moving back to the 51, unfortunately it would meet the scrapper's torch along with the number 50 in 2005 as well. Number 52 was built by the Electro Motor Division in June of 1950. It was built for the Eastern Powerhouse, the Chesapeake in Ohio. For nearly 3 decades, the C&O 5716 served along the system until it was sold to the Chicago South Shore and Bend Railway, with several other C&O GP7s in 1979. The now CSS number 1501 would now serve industries between Chicago and South Bend, Indiana, while also connecting several Class 1s via interchange. Though his career at the CSS would be short-lived, since in the early 80s the locomotive would find itself in the South. Painted into a solid yellow paint scheme that no one could miss, the old workhorse found itself on the South Central Arkansas Railway. It was a very short-lived short line that operated on the old Rock Island Main Line in El Dorado, Arkansas, southward into Louisiana. The Jeep was the last locomotive to operate on the main line. Today, the Ouachita Railroad switches the El Dorado area, and most of the main line towards Ruston, Louisiana has been pulled up. Finally, after the short term on the South Central Arkansas, the now number 52 would join the ranks of the L&W. I want to say that it arrived on the property in 1984. In 1985, the locomotive was rebuilt in the Gibson shops and given the L&W paint scheme. The locomotive was repainted in 2000 as well. As you can see, the basic concept is the same, but the later scheme would have a simplified yellow nose design, and instead of the initials on the side, Louisiana and Northwest would be spelled out. Even though the L&W spent the money on painting it, just 5 years later, it would be scrapped with the other first-generation Jeeps. Let's move on to number 53. Unlike most locomotives, you can actually see the history of this unit due to its physical appearance. Built as GP7 number 2666 for the Santa Fe in January of 1951, this locomotive was part of the extensive GP7U rebuild program. Santa Fe was known for many of their rebuilds, including the CF7 rebuild program, which would convert well over 200 F-unit locomotives to better suit modern freight operations, with steam locomotives becoming out of the picture. The GP7s were rebuilt due to it being a cheaper alternative rather than buying brand new engines. Many of the rebuilds stayed in the roster well into the life of BNSF. Anyways, back to number 53. Its famous Topeka cab wound up on the L&W in the late 1980s. Wearing its blue and yellow bluebonnet paint scheme, it was yet another treat for rail fans in the area to enjoy. In the summer of 1995, 53 was painted in L&W colors. Remember that simpler paint scheme I mentioned 52 receiving in 2000? 53 would be the first to wear the final variation of L&W paint. 2 years later, in 1997, 53 was involved in a derailment near Molnix, just north of Athens. I have a physical photo stored somewhere in my house, but unfortunately I couldn't find it in time for this video. Anyway, the locomotive would round up on its side, causing some rough damage. But 53 would be repaired and returned to service in no time. Several years would pass, and one day 53's AC unit would go out, and instead of fixing it, the engine was just taken out of service. It would soon be sold to S&I Locomotive Services. To this day, SILX number 53 has been serving a grain industry in Alma, Louisiana, just outside of New Orleans, where its paint continues to fade away. Number 54. At the time of its arrival, it was the most modern locomotive to ever serve the L&W. Built in 1965 for the Cotton Belt, number 54 was sold to the L&W in 1990 and began service the following year. The bloody nose paint was replaced by the very similar pattern with red and yellow, substituting in 1992. Sometime in the early 2000s, 54 went out of service. From what I was told by a few credible sources, the issue with 54 was with its wiring. Apparently, the GP35 locomotive was built with aluminum wiring rather than the typical copper wiring. This caused a plethora of issues. I can only assume this is why so many of the GP35s were rebuilt. Eventually, L&W basically gave up on trying to fix the locomotive, and it was placed out behind the shops, where in 2010 it was also purchased by S&I Locomotive Works. It would be patched and renumbered to SILX number 102. Unlike the 53, the former 54 would serve no industries. Since being purchased, it has sat in the deadlines of the SILX facilities in Opelousas, Louisiana. What many employees of the L&W considered the best locomotive on the roster. Number 55 was a perfect example of the Illinois Central's rebuild capabilities. Built as a GP9 labeled as IC 9338 in late 1957, it underwent a rebuild in the Paducah shops to become a GP11. Along with the rebuild in 1979, it was relabeled to Illinois Central Gulf 8717 and would receive its gray and orange paint scheme. Later down the road in its career with the Illinois Central, it would be repainted into Death Star Black. In the year 2000, the now solid black locomotive was operating on L&W rails. By the time I was just starting out on filming stuff, the number 55 was stored behind the locomotive shops. While never in operation, I would often stop by and take several photos throughout the years as it sat back there. 55 was the last of the original fleet to remain on L&W property before the current era of Patriot Rail. In 2018, it would be shipped out of Gippsland. Fortunately, the career of 55 has yet to conclude. It currently works for R.J. Corman with a fresh coat of paint and is numbered as number 550. Last I saw, it was working in Kentucky. The final two locomotives are number 56 and 57. Both of these have very similar stories. 56 and 57 were both built in 1968 for the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton. Both of the locomotives were GP40s. 56 was DT&I number 402, and 57 was number 400. When the 1980s came along and the Orange Regional Railroad was folded into the ranks of the Grand Trunk Western, red and blue paint would be given to both the now 6402 and 6400. While 56 would never get the red and yellow corporate colors, 57 would be the last locomotive to ever receive it. It's also worth noting that both locomotive prime movers were rebuilt at the L&W shops in Gippsland. A few years after Patriot Rail acquired the line, they were sent to the D Queen and Eastern, another short line owned by Patriot Rail. After a few years there, I believe they were sold to Progress Rail and sent to the facilities in Patterson, Georgia. And that's where the trail runs cold for me. If anyone knows the current whereabouts of these locomotives, please let me know down below. It's also worth mentioning that the L&W also had two high-hood first-generation Jeeps that were bought from the KCS, but these were strictly used for spare parts and never hauled any revenue for the railway. That wraps up this video on the original fleet of locomotives that served the L&W. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, leave a like down below. And once again, big thanks to Mr. Moe's Cruise for allowing me to use his photos. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you somewhere out by the rails.